Canada and the United States are now 38 days from a CUSMA review that could decide how much power Washington really has over Canadian trade. Your prices, your job market, your fuel bill, and your border economy could all feel the result. Trump is leaning on tariffs, but Carney still has 5 cards on the table that Washington may not be able to ignore. The clock matters because July 1st is not a normal deadline. It is the moment where threats become bargaining positions and where quiet leverage can become very expensive. For months, the story has been told one way. Canada depends on the United States. Canada sells too much south of the border. Canada cannot afford a full trade fight with Washington. And all of that is partly true. The United States is Canada's biggest customer. Canadian factories, farmers, energy producers, auto suppliers, lumber mills, ports, rail networks, and small border towns are tied deeply into the American market. But that is only half the story. The other half is the part Washington does not like to say out loud. The United States also depends on Canada in ways that are not easy to replace. Not in theory, not in a campaign speech. In the real economy, in refineries, in power grids, in mines, in defense supply chains, in pension capital, in the fighter jets Canada may or may not fully buy. And now, with the first 6-year CUSMA review scheduled for July 1st, 2026, those dependencies are no longer background details. They are bargaining tools. This is why the title of this moment is not simply "Canada Wants Tariff Relief." That is too small. The real story is that Mark Carney is walking into a deadline with 5 unplayed cards, and Trump's team has to decide whether tariffs are worth the cost of forcing Canada to use them. Now, let's be clear from the start. There is no public evidence that Trump's team is literally panicking in private rooms. That claim, stated as a fact, would go too far. What we can say is this: the pressure around Washington is tightening. Tariffs are unpopular with many American voters. Prices remain a live issue. U.S. refiners still rely heavily on Canadian crude. NATO is worried about defense-critical materials. Canada is reviewing a massive F-35 purchase. And the midterms are coming on November 3, 2026, with every House seat and 35 Senate seats on the line. That is what pressure looks like before it becomes visible. And the first card is the one Washington can least afford to dismiss: oil. Not symbolic oil. Actual crude moving through actual pipes into actual American refineries that were designed around heavy barrels. The United States produces a huge amount of energy, but that does not mean every refinery can simply use any crude it wants. Many U.S. refineries, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast system, are built to process heavier crude blends. Canada is the most important supplier in that equation. That is why energy is not just another trade category. It is political oxygen. Gasoline prices are visible every day. They sit on giant signs above roads in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and Texas. They do not need a policy paper. Voters see them on the way to work. And this is where Carney's leverage becomes sharper than it looks. For decades, Canada had a problem. It produced enormous energy wealth, but too much of that wealth had one main buyer: the United States. That gave Washington comfort. It made Canadian oil look trapped. But the Trans Mountain expansion changed the map. It did not eliminate Canada's dependence on the U.S. market, and anyone claiming that Canada can simply walk away from American buyers overnight is exaggerating. But the expansion gave Canadian crude more access to the Pacific, and that means more ability to reach Asian markets. That is not total independence, but it is optionality, and optionality is power. When a seller has only one customer, the customer controls the room. When that seller starts building other routes, even imperfect routes, the negotiation changes. China, Japan, South Korea, and other Asian buyers do not need to replace the United States completely to matter. They only need to give Canada enough room to say, "We have other doors." That is the first warning light for Washington. Because if the Trump administration wants to use tariffs to force Canada into concessions, Canada can answer with a reminder that American energy security does not live in isolation. It is tied to a Canadian supply line. It is tied to a border that usually works quietly. It is tied to a relationship that has been so stable for so long that many Americans forgot it was even a relationship. But infrastructure is diplomacy made physical. Pipelines are policy, refineries are policy, port capacity is policy. And when trust breaks, those systems do not stay neutral. They become leverage. The second card is less visible to ordinary voters, but even more important to the future of military power: critical minerals. This is where the story moves from trade into national security. Modern defense systems do not run on speeches. They run on materials. Fighter jets, radar systems, missile guidance, drones, satellites, secure communications, batteries, night vision equipment, naval systems, and advanced sensors all require specialized materials that are not evenly spread across the world. NATO has identified 12 defense-critical raw materials, including aluminum, cobalt, graphite, lithium, manganese, rare earths, titanium, tungsten, and others. This is not a side issue. This is the backbone of rearmament. The United States and its allies are trying to rebuild defense industrial capacity while reducing dependence on China. That is a hard task. China has major control across parts of the global critical mineral supply chain, especially processing. So when Washington talks about supply chain security or defense resilience, Canada is not just a neighbor. Canada is one of the countries that can help solve the problem. That does not mean Canada can instantly flood the world with every mineral NATO needs. It cannot. This is where the more dramatic version of the story can become too confident. It is tempting to say Canada has all the minerals and can turn the tap tomorrow. That is not how mining works. Mines take years, processing plants take years, permits take years, capital decisions take years, local communities have rights, environmental risks are real. China's processing dominance cannot be undone by a single press conference in Ottawa. But negotiation is not only about what you can deliver tomorrow morning. It is also about what the other side needs for the next decade. And Washington needs trusted mineral supply for the next decade. It needs allies who can help build supply chains outside China's reach. It needs countries that can work inside NATO, the G7, and North American defense networks. Canada can offer much of that. Not perfectly, not cheaply, not instantly, but more credibly than many alternatives. This is why critical minerals give Carney a different kind of card. Oil is immediate. Minerals are strategic. Oil is about what happens at the pump. Minerals are about what happens inside the factory, the base, the lab, and the battlefield. Oil is today's pressure. Minerals are tomorrow's dependency. And if Washington treats Canada like a disposable supplier while asking Canada to help secure the Western defense supply chain, the contradiction becomes obvious. You cannot insult the supplier and then ask for trust. You cannot call the relationship unfair and then ask that same relationship to protect you from China. You cannot build a North American security perimeter while turning the trade border into a political weapon. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream media covers the full picture, the moment to understand it will have passed. Subscribe so you are always ahead of the story, not catching up to it. The third card is money. Not campaign money, not government aid, pension money. Canadian pension funds are not just retirement accounts sitting quietly in the background. They are some of the most sophisticated institutional investors in the world. They own infrastructure, they buy real estate, they invest in energy, ports, highways, data centers, airports, utilities, private equity, public markets, and long-term projects. 10 of Canada's largest pension investors and investment managers represent more than 2.25 trillion Canadian dollars in assets under management. That number matters because capital is power. For years, Canadian pension money has moved across borders looking for returns. A lot of it has gone abroad, including into the United States. That does not mean Carney can pick up the phone and order independent pension managers to pull out of American assets. He cannot simply command fiduciaries to make political trades, and he should not. Pension managers have duties to retirees, workers, teachers, nurses, public employees, and millions of Canadians whose future income depends on disciplined investment decisions. So let's separate fact from interpretation. Fact: Canadian pension funds control enormous pools of capital. Fact: they invest globally, including in infrastructure and private assets. Interpretation: in a trade fight, the political direction of Canadian capital matters. If Canada becomes more serious about building at home, financing at home, and using domestic savings to reduce dependence on the US market, that changes the long-term relationship. That assumption is now being questioned. And this is where Carney's background matters. He is not only a politician, he is a former central banker. He understands markets. He understands signals. He understands that sometimes the strongest pressure is not a loud threat, but a quiet shift in where money wants to go. The fourth card is the F-35. This one is politically sensitive because it touches defense, sovereignty, alliance trust, American jobs, and Canadian identity all at once. Canada has been planning to buy 88 F-35 fighter jets from Lockheed Martin. Ottawa is still reviewing that plan, while Canada has already made a legal commitment for the first 16 aircraft. Other jets from other countries, including alternatives, remain part of the review discussion. That does not prove Carney is keeping the review open as a trade weapon. It could be about cost. It could be about industrial benefits. It could be about sovereignty. It could be about defense timelines. It could be about Canadian jobs. It could be about pressure from allies. It could be about all of those things at once. But here is why Washington cannot ignore it. An 88 aircraft fighter purchase is not just a military order. It is a long-term relationship. It means training, maintenance, software, upgrades, spare parts, bases, supply chains, Canadian industry participation, American defense jobs, political alignment. It ties Canada deeper into the US-led defense ecosystem for decades. So if Ottawa says, "We are still reviewing," Washington hears more than a procurement update. It hears uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable when the seller is used to being the default option. A US defense official has criticized Canada over defense spending and delays around the F-35 process, while Canada has pointed to major planned investments in NORAD modernization and Arctic security. That exchange tells you something important. Defense procurement is no longer separate from the broader relationship. It is part of the same atmosphere of trust and pressure. Canada needs modern fighter jets. Russia's Arctic posture, NORAD demands, long-range missile threats, and the future of air defense all make that clear. The F-35 may still be the aircraft Canada ultimately chooses for the full fleet. Many defense experts argue it offers capabilities that alternatives cannot easily match, especially for interoperability with the United States and other allies. That is the counterpoint. But politically, the fact that the review remains open matters, because it gives Canada a question it can keep alive. If Washington treats Canada as a target in trade, why should Canada automatically deepen dependence on US defense platforms without demanding better treatment across the relationship? That question does not cancel the F-35 deal. It changes the room. It tells Washington that Canada's defense choices are not free of political context. It tells American contractors that trade fights can spill into procurement politics. It tells Congress that tariffs aimed at Canada may create consequences for American industries that have nothing to do with the original dispute. This is the part many people miss. Trade wars do not stay in their lanes. They leak. A tariff on steel can affect cars. A fight over lumber can affect housing. A dispute over autos can affect elections. A fight over Canada can affect defense procurement. A pressure campaign meant to force concessions can create pressure in the other direction. And that brings us to the fifth card, the American election calendar. The US midterms are on November 3rd, 2026. Control of Congress is at stake. Every House seat is on the ballot. 35 Senate seats are up. That means every major policy fight this year is also an election fight. Tariffs are not being judged only by economists. They are being judged by families looking at prices, small businesses looking at costs, farmers looking at export markets, manufacturers looking at supply chains, and candidates looking at polling. This is where tariffs become dangerous for Trump's team. Tariffs can sound strong at a podium. They can sound simple. Tax the foreigner, protect the worker, bring back the factory, punish the unfair trader. It is a clean message. It fits on a sign. But the real world is messier. Imports are not always finished goods from an enemy. Sometimes they are parts used by American manufacturers. Sometimes they are energy inputs for American refiners. Sometimes they are lumber for American homes. Sometimes they are metals for American factories. Sometimes they are food products, machine parts, chemicals, packaging, tools, electronics, or materials that US companies need to keep producing. That is why tariffs can become a tax that hides inside prices. Polling has shown many Americans expect consumer prices to rise after broad tariff moves, and many oppose new tariffs overall. The Tax Foundation's current tracker estimates the 2026 Trump tariffs amount to an average tax increase of about $700 per US household. Those numbers do not mean every voter thinks about trade policy in technical terms. They mean the political risk is obvious. When people already feel squeezed, anything tied to higher prices becomes dangerous. This is why Canada's leverage is not only economic, it is political. If Carney can frame Canada as the reasonable partner trying to preserve North American stability, and Trump as the leader using tariffs in a way that raises costs for Americans, the fight becomes harder for Washington. Not because American voters are suddenly focused on Canadian policy, most are not, but because they are focused on prices. They are focused on jobs. They are focused on whether leaders are making their lives easier or harder. And Canadian countermeasures, procurement delays, energy diversification, and mineral strategies can all feed the same story. Washington started a fight with a close ally, and ordinary people are paying for it. Do you think that is smart strategy or political pressure dressed up as policy? That question matters because both sides have real vulnerabilities. Canada cannot pretend it is immune. It is not. The Canadian economy would feel serious pain from a prolonged trade war. Auto workers in Ontario would feel it. Energy producers in Alberta would feel it. Farmers across the prairies would feel it. Ports, railways, trucking firms, retailers, builders, manufacturers, and households would all feel it. But dependence is not the same as surrender. That is the central point. The United States has scale. Canada has choke points. The United States has market power. Canada has resources. The United States has the louder megaphone. Canada has quiet assets that become louder when the deadline gets closer. CUSMA itself is the container for this fight. The agreement came into force on July 1, 2020, replacing NAFTA's old framework with updated rules for North American trade. Canada's government has described the agreement as central to one of the world's largest free trade regions, with Canada and the United States exchanging billions in goods and services each day. So when Trump uses tariffs as leverage, he is not only pressuring Ottawa, he is pressuring an integrated North American machine, and machines can break in places you did not expect. For American viewers, the impact is direct. If the trade relationship gets worse, the risk is not just that Canada suffers. The risk is that American businesses face higher input costs, American consumers face higher prices, American energy markets lose flexibility, American defense planners face more uncertainty, and American candidates have to defend a policy that many voters associate with inflation. For Canadian viewers, the impact is also direct but different. The question is whether Canada can turn vulnerability into strategy. Can it diversify energy markets fast enough? Can it build port and rail capacity fast enough? Can it move critical mineral projects from speeches to production? Can it attract pension capital into national projects without politicizing retirement savings? Can it keep defense procurement credible while demanding respect from Washington? Can it stand firm without triggering a level of economic damage that ordinary Canadians cannot absorb? That is Carney's challenge. Not to sound tough, to be tough in a way that actually works. Anyone can escalate. Anyone can hold a press conference. Anyone can say Canada has cards. The harder task is sequencing. Which card do you show? Which card do you keep hidden? Which card is a real threat? Which card is only a signal? Which card helps Canada? Which card hurts Canada too much to play? Which card pushes Washington back to the table? Which card pushes Washington into retaliation? This is why the 5 cards idea is useful, but only if we treat it carefully. Energy is a real card, but Canada still needs the US market. Critical minerals are a real card, but projects take time. Pension capital is a real card, but pension funds are not political piggy banks. The F-35 review is a real card, but Canada still needs credible air defense. The US midterm calendar is a real card, but American elections are shaped by many issues, not just trade with Canada. That is the honest version of the analysis, and the honest version is still strong. Because leverage does not require total control. It requires enough pressure to change the other side's calculation. Carney does not need to prove Canada can defeat the United States in a trade war. That would be the wrong goal. Canada cannot outscale America. It cannot replace the US market in 38 days. It cannot move every export route to Asia by July 1st. It cannot instantly build mines, pipelines, ports, and factories because a deadline is approaching. What it can do is raise the cost of American pressure. It can make tariffs more politically expensive. It can make energy decisions more delicate. It can make defense procurement more uncertain. It can make mineral cooperation more conditional. It can make investors and businesses ask whether North America is still a stable platform or becoming a political battlefield. That is the real leverage, not domination, cost. If Trump wants to keep tariffs on the table, Carney's job is to make sure Washington sees the bill. Not just the bill for Canada, the bill for America. The bill for consumers, the bill for refiners, the bill for defense companies, the bill for supply chains, the bill for candidates running in November. And here is where the timing becomes almost perfect for Canada. July 1st comes before November 3rd. That means the CUSMA review happens while the US political system is already moving toward the midterms. Every bad price headline matters more. Every plant warning matters more. Every farm complaint matters more. Every market wobble matters more. Every story about tariffs raising costs becomes campaign material. Washington can still choose escalation. It may believe the pressure on Canada will hurt Ottawa more than it hurts the White House. That might be the calculation. And to be fair, there are American officials and voters who believe tariffs are worth the pain if they bring back manufacturing or force better terms. Many communities in the United States have watched factories close, wages stagnate, and trade promises fail. Their anger did not come from nowhere. But anger is not a supply chain plan, and tariffs are not magic. If the goal is to rebuild American manufacturing, then raising costs on allied inputs can backfire. If the goal is to counter China, then fighting Canada can weaken the allied network Washington needs. If the goal is to help workers, then making energy, housing, cars, and consumer goods more expensive can hurt the same households the policy claims to protect. That is the contradiction Carney can exploit. He can say Canada is not asking for special treatment. Canada is asking Washington to respect the rules of the deal it signed. He can say North American strength comes from trusted supply chains, not tariff chaos. He can say Canada will defend its workers, its industries, and its sovereignty, but it will also keep the door open for a deal. That posture matters because it lets Canada look firm without looking reckless. And that is important for global audiences too, because this fight is not happening in a vacuum. China is watching, Europe is watching, Mexico is watching, Japan and South Korea are watching, NATO allies are watching, investors are watching. Every time Washington puts tariffs on a close partner, rivals get a message. The US-led system is less predictable than it claims. Every time Canada looks for new markets, partners get another message. Even America's closest neighbors are hedging. That word matters, hedging. Canada is not breaking with the United States. It is not joining an anti-American bloc. It is not pretending geography changed, but it is seeking more energy routes, more mineral partnerships, more defense options, more domestic investment, more non-US export growth, more room to breathe. And for Washington, that is the quiet danger. The immediate risk is a hard CUSMA review. The deeper risk is a Canada that stops assuming the US relationship is safe by default. Once that mental shift happens, it does not reverse easily. Businesses adjust, governments adjust, voters adjust, investors adjust. The old trust premium disappears. Deals require more guarantees. Procurement becomes more political. Infrastructure becomes more strategic. Public opinion becomes harder. The relationship still exists, but it becomes more conditional. That may be the biggest cost of the tariff strategy. Not one price increase, not one delayed deal, not one angry speech. A permanent change in how Canada sees the United States. Should Canada move faster toward new partners, or keep putting most of its energy into repairing the relationship with Washington? There is no easy answer. Canada cannot simply pivot away from the United States. The geography is too powerful. The supply chains are too deep. The economies are too integrated. The defense relationship is too important. But Canada also cannot pretend the old model works if Washington uses dependence as a weapon every time politics demands it. That is the balance Carney is trying to strike. He has to show enough strength that Trump cannot treat Canada like a soft target, but he also has to avoid a spiral that damages Canadian workers more than it pressures Washington. He has to use leverage without looking like he is threatening America's security. He has to defend sovereignty while keeping the alliance functional. He has to move fast enough to matter by July 1st, but not so fast that markets think Canada is improvising. That is a narrow path, but it is not a weak path. It is the path of a smaller country that understands the bigger country has problems too. Trump's team may believe tariffs give Washington control because the US economy is larger. But size is not the only form of power. Timing is power. Supply is power. Trust is power. Alternatives are power. Political pain is power. And Canada has enough of each to make this review dangerous for anyone who assumes Ottawa will simply fold. The next 38 days are not just about one trade clause or one tariff line. They are about whether North America remains a rules-based economic platform or becomes a pressure system driven by domestic politics. They are about whether Canada can force respect without triggering a wider rupture. They are about whether Trump can keep using tariffs without paying a price inside the very country he says he is protecting. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story. So here is where the story stands tonight. Carney's 5 cards are real, but they are not magic. Oil gives Canada immediate weight. Critical minerals give Canada strategic weight. Pension capital gives Canada financial weight. The F-35 review gives Canada defense industrial weight. The US midterms give Canada political timing. Together, they do not make Canada stronger than the United States. They make Canada harder to pressure than Washington may have expected. That resolves the first tension. Canada is vulnerable, but it is not helpless. The new question is whether Carney can use these cards without forcing Trump to double down just to avoid looking weak. In my next video, I am covering the one Canadian move that could hit Washington even harder than tariffs, and what I found will change how you see this.